Good evening and most welcome to H741. We will today start a little triology. We will discuss certain things that has to do with early technological development, amongst other things. And today I will discuss the emerald painting. At least that's what I think it's called in English. In Swedish it's called smaragdtavlan, but I think emerald is smaragd. That's paint. It's a scripture from the 7th century after Christ. It was authored in Arabic, but it was in the Hermetic tradition of Plato. And this is an interesting aspect mentioned, for instance, by Ian McGilchrist and Julian Jaynes. And it's the fact that although the Greek Romans and Romans also went into the path of transcendence, they didn't go the whole way as we did. And they seem to have stopped somewhere, tried to stop anyway. And you'd be surprised, we've been downputting Plato, Aristotle and others. But that's mainly for the reason for the seed they spread. But other aspects of their thinking is very sound from a modern perspective. And in the emerald painting you can read that Plato saw a connection between what he called macrocosmos and microcosmos. And that tendency continued well into the Renaissance and was slowly disappeared in the 18th century. And the idea was partly affected by what is epistemology and what is causality. Those are two things that are very important in this connection. And for Plato, it was actually always the fact that microcosmos and microcosmos were connected. That was something that was part of knowledge. Not a thing that you had in knowledge, but to be knowledge, that is what knowledge expresses. And that is a very different take compared to what we have today. Today we try to get the little together with the small, with the big. And this is called the unified theory of everything. Theory that, for instance, Stephen Hawking tried to put together, but he's not alone. It has been very important for most physicists to do that, and also some philosophers. But the odd thing here is that once upon a time, that was knowledge. It was not you had knowledge of, but to be knowledge, it was putting everything together. Isn't that interesting? That's quite the difference. And I'll try at least to give an explanation why it changed. And I will also give some causes to what caused that change, and also why it could be good to think about these things quite hard, because that changes quite a lot. It's a different thing altogether, trying to put together something that was divided, than like Plato and also Aristotle and most of the philosophers, thinking that knowledge always is the whole. And if you remember when we discussed David Bohm, for instance, but also Stephen M. Rosen, these are people who think that knowledge is about everything all the time. It's universalism, or more correct, a sort of holism. Everything is connected. And this macrocosmos, that is the microcosmos and macrocosmos together, contains practical knowledge, but also moral knowledge. And that always went without saying. And this is the reason we today think it's a bit odd to look at the things in heavens for what is supposed to be our fate. We don't do that anymore. And if we should do it, that would be a sort of a complement to the ordinary world. But it was not like that for Aristotle. It was natural that the stars told the fortune, what's going to happen in your life or the life of the nation, or only what weather is supposed to be the next day. And the idea was also connected to the body, and it was that the planets had specific effects on the human organs, and they could affect bodily functions. This is also connected to, as I mentioned previously, epistemology. How do we attain knowledge? We briefly sort of brushed past this last week when we started to discuss distance and nearness. And although very short, I just mentioned that if you, for instance, want to study a Bible text, if you from the beginning take the stance of being at a distance is the only way to understand something, you have already sort of hypothesized something that it's not legit to do. You need to explain why it's only at a distance you can sort of investigate something. This is close to that because they had a complete different take on what knowledge is. For them, knowledge was actually always something very close, almost always. So they shifted their focal points, focal settings, much more than we do today. And I think that's sort of natural, because if you don't determine how knowledge turns up and say that it has to be on the distance, I think that's more natural. That will happen without a reason, because you have internal information that you get from, instance, the body, your environment, where you are situated in reality. That is very deciding for what sort of conclusions they came to. So not only, and this is, I can retake this, not only were the conclusions in Plato and Aristotle different from ours, we know that, but the way they got to their conclusions is also radically different from how we reach conclusions today. And we seem to be in a lockdown of there is only way of looking at things, and that is, yeah, you have to be on a rather far away position. Another thing that I will go into deeper in the coming 2 other lectures I will do in this series, I call this C1, and C stands for causality. I will have 3 lectures about causality because we have not taken up this before specifically, and that also changed, and there is a different causality when it comes to Aristotle, Plato, and a lot of other philosophers that actually changed in quite recent time. Only a couple of centuries ago, we still have this other idea of causality, and now we're stuck in the causality, which I will show to you. It's not very clear what it is about. As you might know, Aristotle had 4 causes. 4, not 1, as we think we have today. The first one was the effective cause. That describes what or who did the stuff. And then you have the material cause. That describes what something is made of. And then you have the formal cause, and that is what's telling what sort of physical property does a thing has or have to make it what it is. For instance, a thermos would have been made of metal, well, nowadays. And then you have something that we think is really odd today, and that's the final cause. The final cause, I don't mean it's the last on my list. No, it's a teleological cause. For what is something going in that direction? And I'd say the teleological cause, it's something that never turned up again, ever in thinking history, since its disappearance somewhere, let's say 16th century, 17th century, earlier than the event of Cartesius or Newton for that instance. But it did actually turn up in a new aspect of science. Well, 2 aspects. One is quantum physics, but it's very hard to explain how quantum physics is teleological. But the other one, where it's much easier, that's actually chaos theory. Chaos theory always have a teleological direction. And that puts it in quite a different strand than all other theories we have today. There is a purpose in everything. And without knowing the purpose, you can't understand what's happening. It's rather interesting, isn't it? And as you hear, this is radically different how we presented Aristotle, Plato, and those chapters before. They have always been boxing bags for our anger against the left hemisphere dominance. But they actually had something that we lack today, and this is this wholeness of knowledge. Well, how do you understand these 4 causes? Well, you can take a statue of Achilles, and the material cause, it's what's made of. For instance, bronze, I think Achilles was made of. And the formal cause for the statue is the beautiful body of Achilles. And the final cause is to celebrate Achilles. And the effective cause is the sculpture. And we have to remember there can be different subtypes or varieties of the same types. It's more correct to say varieties of the same type. It can have different final causes, for instance. It could be decorative, and it could possibly, in some cases, just act as a place that you hang your clothes on. It's sacrilegious, but that could actually be final cause for a statue of Achilles. Very expensive clothes hanger. But the most telling aspect in the Aristotelian formation of knowledge, especially when you come to the effective and final causes, it's that they define objects in their relations to other objects. So to have knowledge about something, that means you could put it into a network of relations to other things, especially what makes them to come to existence and who are using them. And you see here, this actually goes hand in hand what came later, Christianity. Because Christianity wants to see a final cause in relation to something else. And that's the will of God. So you see here, Plato in that aspect was very subservient to Christianity. And that is one of the reasons Platonism entered into Christianity. Especially with Augustinus. I would say he was a Neoplatonist, and he put final cause into religion. And that's the will of God. And nature had a final cause, and that was creation. And you could say they were put in a sort of program in the first effective cause. The first effective cause, that was the sculpture when we were speaking of the sculpture of Achilles. But the first effective cause later came to be none other than three-letter person, God.
Mm-hmm.
And then by then it was established God was the cause of everything. And since that time it has been important that God was the cause of everything. And later on, and this is most telling, God disappeared. But what remained was the first effective cause. This is actually today the Big Bang. So you see here, they are creating each other. So even though we put in Plato's thinking into Christianity to have a first effective cause, that made God something to be with us. It was part of ontology. But later when God disappeared, the first effective cause linked on. And that is very interesting. This is not the case, for instance, in some varieties of Christianity that was never affected by Plato. There is no first effective cause among them. And of course, when we turn over to the Big Bang, it's oddly enough, it was actually, I think, I don't remember, one of the Piuses, I think, one of the popes, they really liked, well, at least two of them liked the Big Bang theory, because they were so into the first material cause. So they thought, this is perfect. Now we have Big Bang. That is going to prove God's existence. And I think even the discoverer of the Big Bang thought that that could actually be the case. But it's not used that way anymore. I think that happiness lasted only 1 year or something like that. Nowadays, I rather say what the first material cause is doing is eliminating God even more. Because now you have a handy solution to what created the universe. You don't need God, and you get a sort of an equation where God is not a place taker. Do you understand? It's like something was created once upon a time, and I can write it up like an equation. Like this. And in order to have God, let's say God is Y, Why God, you ask? No. No jokes here. God was put into the equation, and you got at the same time a material cause. That was handy for Augustinus, for instance. But then God disappeared. But you still have a material cause. And there's not many people that ponder about these things these days, because this has consequences. Now you have an equation that helps people to think that there is no God, in a way. That's actually one of its uses. It was constructed to prove God, or be in congruence with God in existence, and in the end it came to have the opposite purpose. But you feel this connection rather clear still at the 17th century. You have the philosopher of nature, Robert Boyle, excellent writer, and his most famous for his development within chemistry. And we who studied chemistry know that Boyle's law comes from this Robert Boyle. And this law shows that any mass of gas is in reverse proportion against the pressure that acts on it. And in this, he compares the gas mass to a novel, well woven. It's not easy for a Swede to pronounce that. A novel, well woven. I managed 2 times. I think it's a good record for me. Boyle here referred to French gigantic novels that he really liked. These novels could be up to 2,000 pages long, and that put your memory on trial, because there is a gazillion people participating in the novel, being the actors in the novel. And they are all involved in different complex life stories. They meet each other and they separated in ways that are very far from probable, or something that is constantly revealed is that who is secretly in love with who, and who in reality is a lost brother or child. And you can remember or recognize these themes from modern novels on the television, usually the same. But for Boyle, the creator himself was the ultimate novel author. And he saw the world as a novel he read. And in this world, he tried to understand the history of the novel, how the different things in the book of the world is related to each other, exactly like in the well-woven book. Now I said it 3 times. And this is an incredibly different take on nature. This doesn't exist today. So he saw everything to be interconnected, and that's where he started. The interconnectedness was knowledge still for Robert Boyle. And I think this is so close to where it changes. I think he died somewhere late 17th century, and only a couple of decades later it started to change. Because after that, two different takes on reality became more important. That you saw the world from a distance, always unchanging on a distance, and that everything in the world have to be separated. There was two demands. So you see here, this separation was a development of knowledge. It's not something we find when we look at the world. It was something that we force upon the world. And the world doesn't demand that we look at the world by distance. Actually, we are in the world, so it makes much more sense to look at the world from a nearby perspective. But we can choose whatever we want to. We are at liberty to do that. But the other thing, the other aspect, that everything is disconnected, fragmented, that became a very important trait of all knowledge after, let's say, 18th century. There shouldn't be any connection there. And knowledge should be constructed as there were no connection in the world. And this is the reason why the Renaissance geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, Tizian, who else, Caravaggio to some extent, they mixed, as we think, different strands of knowledge. But actually for them, there were no mix at all. It was all part of exactly the same thing, knowledge. Because if the world is interconnected, as Robert Boyle said, a well-woven novel, then your knowledge will show that, because you start there. So I would say, I get the feeling here that you have a turn going from saying that knowledge is wholeness, it includes everything, all aspects of reality, and then you say knowledge is not that. Knowledge is fragmentation. It should be separated, otherwise it's not knowledge. And on a parallel level, what happens is here, I just going to make 2 lines. On a parallel level, you say that knowledge is fragmented, you also get different strands of knowledge at exactly the same time. And that is a development that has continued since. And it's not a very far-fetched guess to say that the more everything gets fragmented, the more subjects we get. We started out with one subject, we called it knowledge, and now we have 500 or something like that. And that inevitably gives the expression, the impression, and the perception that everything is in parts, not as wholes. And there are so many depictions of the time where they made paintings, for instance, to show that the different strands were interconnected and were actually the different show-offs of the same thing. Music and optics, geography, medicine, that music could be healing, that optics could both tell the stars and help you with your eyesight, and geography was connected to music. Can you imagine how different take on knowledge that was? And it's not hard to understand what caused this, well, what helped to cause this separation. Of course, the calculus was very important in this, but also the separatedness of technology from the other knowledges. It was almost like technology was the first thing that said, I want to be separate. And therefore, physics, for instance, took a foundational form to say, we are bigger than everything else. We are the foundation for reality. In this separated reality, where all other strands of knowledge are originally coming from physics, but they are deviations of some sort, or best case scenario, they are actually somehow arithmetically, like biology, counted out from technology or physics. And of course, the reason for this was technology's fantastic powers of predicting things within technology. There's no criticism here, but that was so amazing, so we forgot that long ago. But all of a sudden, things that we've been guessing for centuries, millennia, all of a sudden, with the calculus, you can count everything. You can know the stability of your house, you can know how much gravel you need to put in the foundation, you can know how to make the cement, how many piles of woods do you need to make it stable. All those things, all of a sudden you can count, and then you can count on chemistry, and you can show what's going to happen before it's happened. This predictive authority of technology is unique, and that's what I mentioned. That's why I mentioned epistemology. This was a completely new way of knowledge, especially coming with the calculus. Magically, you can know in advance what was going to happen. You never know that before. And in so many cases to do with practicality. And I would say one of the things that are very important that time was the military advancement. All of a sudden you can calculate where is the bullet, for instance, going to land, or how much gunpowder do you need, what sort of parable, this is called parable in Swedish, parable I think in English as well, or parallax of a shooting gun, and when the cannonball is supposed to land or when it's supposed to explode. All those things magically technology could understand, and therefore it got the prime position. And since it was regular, ordered, working like almost like before the heavenly spheres, this took over. So technology, as its loyal adjutant, mathematics, became the primes of the new knowledge. And their motto is always fragmentation, because everything you count is different. For a good reason, because things in the world are different. The calculus used for a horse and wagon is not the same used for building a house. And this very intensely gives the impression that the world was always fragmented. And this is the worldview I want to sort of jumble up a bit, because it's not correct. And this is not an intentional wrong dealing you get in school, for instance, because the educational system just want to explain what did Aristotle do and what was physics before Newton. I want to explain to you. But what they do is they use the fragmentization of Newton to explain what Aristotle did, or what the Greek did, or the medieval people did. And that makes into your head the impression it has always been this way. And no, it has not. And I would even say, in a way, it's no longer like that. But that news hasn't spread to the people. But it's impossible if you don't know that. If you don't heard the gospel of the world not being fragmentized as it comes from quantum mechanics or case theory, you will believe that. It's not to believe because it's even stronger. It's something you practically can see. And there is no way on earth any argument is going to convince you. If you tried something and it actually works, that's stronger than any argument. And that's the reason fragmentization today is the leading point in all strands of knowledge. And that's why it's used in theology. killing off God and the soul and everything. Obviously, once you try something, you get convinced. It's like if I were to see a person flying, I would believe it. But it doesn't matter how much proof I see on the television, on the internet, I wouldn't believe it. There's no chance. But if I see it myself and I can feel it, I do believe it. So that's the difference, how we believe in something. The strongest belief is the practical belief. And that's why technology has become so successful when it comes to putting down the rules for what knowledge is today. It was not intended from technology to have that position. It was given to it by us. And involuntarily so, by just using technology, we get convinced. And I'd say there were actually some people who understood this. One was these religious movements, what are they called? Anabaptist, something like that, I'm not 100% sure. But they understood that technology will convince you. So they banned technology in their sect. Still to this day, if you find them, they don't use technology. They don't even use buttons, I think, because that was actually a new invention. They do not use cotton, only wool. They do not use engines, machinery, anything like that. Because they understood if you use that, we're going to be atheists. And oddly enough, they still exist, and they have very harmonious societies, for instance, in Central America. I visited one of those that made cheese. That's the reason I visited them. But they're still quite harmonious. We've proven their health is much better. They don't eat healthy, but they live better lives and all that. They shed themselves from technology, and if you start using a mobile, you are shunned. You're out of the society. So they have a keen understanding of this. I think we lost that. Today we think, well, I can use technology, it won't affect me. I can still have my own beliefs. I say as an engineer, that's bullshit. That will never happen. If you use technology, that knowledge will affect you. And therefore we need a very steady countermeasure, because even though it's practical, you can use it, it's still not the truth. It's not the whole truth. So we need to bodily understand that the world is different. And you do that by using your body in the most harmonious way, because it's a bit disharmonious to disjunct and fragment both mind and body. So by using your body, learning the body, it's a whole, that it has a direction, unlike machines that don't have directions. And then I think you can be saved. You don't have to be lured by the machine, as long as you are in balance. Well, that got a lot more philosophical than I was hoping for. I think that's the late hour and we need to shut here. I say thank you very much and have a very good night.
Thank you.